I just spent 9 hours binge-watching the latest season of Stranger Things, and by the end, I wasn't thinking about the plot or the characters or the monster. I was thinking about how exhausted I am by manufactured nostalgia, masquerading as storytelling. That's when I realized Stranger Things isn't really a show about the 1980s, or monsters, or friendship. It is a $3 billion franchise built on the idea that constantly reminding you of better shows and movies from 40 years ago counts as entertainment. Can you guess which streaming service I'm talking about? If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means everything as I share these honest takes about overhyped entertainment. My name is Alex, and I'm a 32-year-old who was born in 1993, which means I have zero actual memories of the 1980s. But after watching Stranger Things, you'd think I lived through that decade twice. The show has bombarded me with so many references, so much 80s aesthetic, so many callbacks to movies I've only seen because Stranger Things made them culturally relevant again, that I feel like I've been force-fed someone else's childhood, and that's the problem. Stranger Things doesn't trust its own story enough to stand alone. Every single scene is drowning in references to better content. The kids riding bikes. That's E.T., the government conspiracy. That's every Spielberg thriller from that era. The small-town setting with supernatural elements. That's every Stephen King adaptation. The synth soundtrack. That's John Carpenter. The creature design. That's H.R. Geiger and Alien. Nothing about Stranger Things is original. It's a greatest hits compilation of 1980s pop culture wearing a thin veneer of plot. When the show first premiered in 2016, I'll admit I was charmed. It was fun. It was different from everything else on Netflix at the time. The kids were likable. The mystery was engaging. The nostalgia felt fresh because nobody else was doing it quite that aggressively. But then Season 2 came out, and Season 3, and Season 4, and now we're waiting for Season 5, which will supposedly wrap everything up after nearly a decade of this show, dragging out what should have been a single-season story. And with each passing season, the nostalgia has gotten more suffocating. It's not subtle, it's not clever. It's not even particularly well integrated into the plot anymore. It's just there, constantly, reminding you that better content exists. Remember, the mall setting in Season 3. That wasn't about the characters or the story. That was about reminding you that malls were a thing in the 80s. Remember the video store? Remember the arcade? Remember New Coke? Remember every single song they play at maximum volume to make sure you register the time period. The exhausting part isn't just the references. It's the way the show has convinced an entire generation of people who were uneven born in the 1980s that they re-nostalgic for that decade. I see people my age wearing Stranger Things merchandise and waxing poetic about how they wish they'd grown up in the 80s. They're nostalgic for a time they never experienced, based entirely on a Netflix show that's nostalgic for movies and TV shows from that era. It's nostalgia for nostalgia. It's recursive and hollow and completely manufactured. The show isn't creating anything new or meaningful. It's repackaging someone else's memories and selling them back to a generation that's desperate for anything that feels authentic in our current cultural wasteland. And we rebuying it by the millions because we've been convinced that recognizing references is the same thing as experiencing good storytelling. Let me break down exactly how Stranger Things operates. Every episode follows the same formula. Open with a scene that establishes mood and atmosphere, usually borrowing heavily from a specific 80s movie. Then the main plot kicks in, which is always some variation of the kids discover something supernatural. The adults don't believe them. Eventually everyone bands together to fight the monster. Along the way, there are approximately 400 visual and audio references to 80s pop culture crammed into every frame. The characters ride bikes past a video store playing a specific 80s movie poster in the background. Someone's wearing a t-shirt from a band that was popular in 1985. The soundtrack drops a needle on a song you vaguely remember from your parents' playlist. And the plot, the actual story underneath all that nostalgia dressing. It's paper thin. Season 1 was about a kid who goes missing and a girl with powers who helps find him. That's fine. That's a complete story. But then they had to keep going because Netflix needed a flagship show and nostalgia sells. So Season 2 introduced a bigger monster and more government conspiracy. Season 3 added Russian spies and a mall. Season 4 split the kids up across multiple locations and introduced yet another bigger monster and more backstory. 411 that nobody asked for. Each season gets longer, more convoluted, and more reliant on spectacle over substance. The character development has stalled completely. Mike is still the same earnest kid he was in Season 1, just older. Dustin is still the comic relief. Lucas is still underwritten. Will spent an entire season being possessed and has been mostly irrelevant ever since. Nancy and Steve have been circling the same will they won't they dynamic for years. Joyce is still the worried mom. Hopper died and came back because of course he did. The only character with any real arc is 11, and even that's gotten repetitive. She loses her powers. She gets them back. She learns about her past. She's traumatized by it. She fights the monster. She wins through sheer determination and love for her friends. Repeat for 5 seasons. It's not character development, it's a loop. But we keep watching because the show is very good at pushing our nostalgia buttons. It's weaponized nostalgia. Carefully engineered to make us feel something even when the story itself isn't earning those emotions. The synth soundtrack swells. The kids ride their bikes in slow motion. Someone says something about friendship being the real power. And we feel moved, not because the show has built to that moment in a meaningful way, but because we've been conditioned by decades of 80s movies to respond emotionally to those specific visual and audio cues. Here's what really bothers me about Stranger Things and the nostalgia epidemic it represents. It's teaching an entire generation of viewers that storytelling is about reference and aesthetic rather than substance. Young writers and creators are watching Stranger Things become one of the most successful shows in Netflix history and learning the wrong lessons. They're learning that you don't need original ideas or complex characters or meaningful themes. You just need to identify a decade or era that people are nostalgic for and recreate its aesthetic while borrowing its best ideas. We're seeing this everywhere now. Every streaming service has their nostalgia play. There are reboots and revivals and continuations of properties from 20, 30, 40 years ago. There are new shows set in past decades that do exactly what Stranger Things does, just with different reference pools. It's cultural cannibalism. We've run out of new ideas, so we're just endlessly remixing and repackaging old ones. And the audience is complicit in this. We reward nostalgia with our viewership and our money. We make shows like Stranger Things into massive hits because recognizing references gives us a dopamine hit. It makes us feel smart, makes us feel connected to something, makes us feel like we're part of a cultural moment. But what are we actually connecting to? Someone else's memories, a decade we didn't experience, a TV show that's itself just a collection of references to other TV shows and movies. I stopped watching Stranger Things halfway through season 4. I couldn't do it anymore. Every episode felt like homework, like I was being tested on my knowledge of 1980s pop culture rather than experiencing a story. And when I skipped to the finale to see how it ended, I wasn't surprised to find it was just more of the same. Big spectacle, heavy nostalgia, characters going through the motions of emotional beats that the show hadn't actually earned. When I told people I'd stopped watching, the reactions were intense. Some people were genuinely offended, like I'd insulted their childhood even though most of them were born in the 90s like me. Others were defensive, explaining why the show is actually brilliant, and I just don't understand it. A few admitted they'd also gotten bored but felt obligated to finish because everyone else was watching. That's the power of nostalgia-driven content. It creates this false sense of obligation. If you're not watching Stranger Things, you're missing out on the cultural conversation. You're not getting the references that will dominate social media for weeks. You're not part of the collective experience. But here's the thing, that collective experience is hollow. It's not based on meaningful art or storytelling. It's based on recognizing the same references and consuming the same content as everyone else. I'd rather spend my time watching shows that have something new to say, shows that trust their own stories enough to not rely on constant callbacks to better content. Shows that understand nostalgia can be a spice but shouldn't be the entire meal. Stranger Things is all nostalgia, no substance, and I'm exhausted by it. The real tragedy is that buried somewhere under all those references and 80s aesthetic choices, there might have been a good story. The basic premise of Season 1. Kids dealing with supernatural events in a small town while navigating friendship and adolescence. That has potential. The performances from the young actors are genuinely good. Some of the emotional moments, when they're not drowning in nostalgia manipulation, actually land. But all of that gets buried under the weight of constant reference making. The show doesn't trust itself enough to just be a story about these characters. It has to constantly remind you of E.T. and Alien and the Goonies and Stand By Me and every other 80s property that did these ideas better. And now we're approaching Season 5, which will apparently conclude the story after nearly a decade. I guarantee it will be the most self-indulgent, nostalgia-heavy season yet. They'll pull out every stop, every reference, every callback to not just the 80s but to their own previous seasons. There will be emotional reunions and sacrifices, and probably someone will die for real this time. And millions of people will cry and declare it the best season yet. Not because the story earned those emotions, but because nostalgia is a powerful drug and Stranger Things is very good at dealing it. I won't be watching. I'm done with Stranger Things and the exhausting nostalgia industrial complex it represents. I'm done with shows that mistake reference for storytelling, aesthetic for substance, recognition for emotion. I am done being sold someone else's memories and told that it's the same thing as creating new ones. Life is too short to spend it consuming content that's just recycling better content from decades past. There are original stories being told, shows and movies and books that have new ideas and fresh perspectives, but they're being drowned out by the noise of nostalgia, by audiences who would rather experience the familiar comfort of recognition than the challenging discomfort of genuinely new art. Stranger Things is the perfect example of everything wrong with modern entertainment. It's safe, it's reference-heavy, it's stretched far beyond what the story can support, and it's wildly successful because we've been conditioned to reward exactly these qualities. We claim we want original content, but what we actually reward with our viewership is nostalgia bait. So yes, I hate Stranger Things. Not because it's poorly made or poorly acted, not because the people involved aren't talented, but because it represents the worst impulses in modern storytelling. The impulse to look backward instead of forward. The impulse to recycle instead of create. The impulse to make audiences feel something through manipulation and reference rather than through genuine emotional storytelling. The nostalgia is exhausting, and I'm done pretending otherwise. If you love Stranger Things, great. Enjoy Season 5. I genuinely hope it gives you what you're looking for. But for me, I'll be spending my time on stories that have something new to say. Stories that trust themselves enough to not need constant reference to better content. Stories that understand nostalgia is a tool, not a crutch. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us stop rewarding lazy nostalgia-driven content with our viewership, studios will start investing in original ideas again. We'll get shows that are set in the present or the future, instead of endless revisitations of the past. We'll get stories that create new cultural touchstones instead of endlessly referencing old ones. That's the future I want. Not one where we're forever looking backward, forever nostalgic for decades we never experienced, forever consuming content that's just remixing what came before, but one where we're creating new memories, new stories, new art that future generations will look back on and actually have reason to feel nostalgic about. Stranger Things isn't that, it never was. And I'm done pretending the exhausting weight of manufactured nostalgia is the same thing as good storytelling. The Emperor has no clothes. He's just wearing a vintage 1985 members-only jacket and hoping you don't notice the difference.